Good evening, welcome. And congratulations for giving up a rainy Wednesday evening to be here at the Marshall Institute and LSE to hear what we think will be an interesting and provocative talk. This is the last of this year's Marshall Institute lectures, and I'm rather pleased about it. Not that it's the last, but that we have as our speaker tonight someone I've been friends with for a very long time, and someone who has just been practitioner in residence here at the LSE. And those of you who know Tom Rippin will know that he is quite hard working. And I expected him to show up occasionally, drink our coffee, be around when we had nice food. And in fact, he's been around the whole time working really, really hard on a bunch of really, really hard questions. And we have persuaded him to give us some insight into what he's been working on over the last couple of months. Most of you are here because you know and admire his work. I'm going to tell you one thing that I'm pretty sure none of you knows, which is that he's really an Englishman who grew up in Switzerland. And I'm really a Swiss who grew up in England. And I suspect that's why we have this long-standing affinity. The story of this evening is that Tom's going to talk to us, and then a colleague and collaborator of Tom's is going to ask him some questions on our behalf. Lawrence Shorter, whom you will meet at the end of Tom's talk, is the author of The Optimist and the author of The Lazy Guru's Guide to Life. He's going to ask Tom some questions, then he's going to ask you to ask Tom some questions. When the time comes, wait for the microphone so that we can record your scintillating questions. Try to frame the questions in the form of a question. At the end of the evening, which is just before 8 o'clock, I will come back up here and thank and summarize. So, Tom, welcome to your inaugural LSE lecture. Welcome to the Nature of Business.
Great. Thank you, Stefan, for the very kind introduction. I want to start with some thank yous myself, actually. Firstly, to the Marshall Institute for hosting me for what has been a wonderful sabbatical. You are not only a very stimulating place, but a wonderful bunch of people, and gave me a very warm welcome as well, so thank you for that. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, my board, and especially my interim colleagues who also put that extra effort and time in to make my sabbatical possible. It's hugely appreciated. And I also thirdly want to thank Lawrence Shorter, who's sitting here at the front, for all the work and help he's given me in putting together not just how this talk is going to happen, but also actually the ideas in this talk as well. And you'll meet him later in the evening. The nature of business and the nature of our economy is, I think, one of the biggest problems that we need to tackle. And I've long thought that if we want to tackle the biggest problems, we really need to use the latest, most cutting-edge thinking that we can muster. Trying to create an economy that works for all, in which everyone can live a dignified life, and which happens within the bounds of nature, is, I think, literally the biggest single problem that faces us as a society today. And we don't have much time to solve it. And that's essentially what I'm going to talk about this evening. Before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit of how I come to be standing here. And I've realized that looking back on what I've done so far, it always seems to be easier when you look back than when you're in the middle of it. I've seen a bit of a kind of theme, which is trying to use what I consider at least to be kind of quantitative, hard, analytical thinking and apply that to kind of big and difficult and meaningful problems. That started in my undergraduate when I did chemistry, chemistry is kind of the softest of the hard science. I really wasn't cut out to do physics, I'm afraid. But chemistry I could cope with. And actually, if you want to understand how the world works, then chemistry is where it's at. By the time I finished my undergraduate and was contemplating my PhD, that kind of boundary of where quantitative thinking really occurs had kind of moved into the biological sciences. And I was lucky enough to do a PhD in cancer research, but applying kind of biophysical methods to the big problem of cancer. Now, by the end of my PhD, I kind of figured that academia was maybe important, though the topic it seemed quite narrow, and I was more interested in some of those bigger, wider issues around which we face as a society and which we have in our environment. It might surprise you to hear that I because of that, obviously went into management consultancy. But that did actually give me a bit of an appreciation of how the world, or at least the private sector world, works. And I'm still very proud to have worked for a firm that, again, prides itself on what it calls its fact-based approach and of being very analytical and very rigorous and of solving just the very biggest problems for its clients. Now, that approach kind of went all the way through into founding On Purpose, which happened nearly 10 years ago now. And one way of thinking about On Purpose, which is essentially a leadership program that helps people dedicate their careers to trying to bring about an economy that works for all of us. One way of thinking about On Purpose is that it is precisely trying to help develop people to think in these hard and rigorous and quantitative ways and apply them to some of the biggest problems we face as a society. Now, in kind of working for the last few years at On Purpose, what I've had the opportunity to do is to think more and more about how the economy works and how we talk about the economy and how organizations work. And what I've realized is that, frankly, it feels to me, at least in our public discourse, probably not in real academia, but certainly in our public discourse, we're actually a lot of the time still using 19th century concepts. We are not bringing that cutting-edge thinking that we really need to be bringing to be solving the really difficult problems that we have in front of us. And so I was incredibly privileged to be able to come here to the Marshall Institute and spend 5 years, I wish. It's clearly a Freudian slip. 5 months just reading about this and finding out more about it. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. And the news is going to come in two parts. There's going to be some bad news and there's going to be some good news. But we're going to make sure that we end on the good news for you. And I also want to just flag that some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about, I know a fair amount about. Some of the stuff is quite new territory for me. But please bear with me. And I'm sure that collectively we'll hopefully make some progress on it. Now, a few weeks ago, I met a lady who for the past 10 years has been working in Camden Council. As you can imagine, with austerity, that's not an easy place to be working for the past 10 years. And part of her role was to go and visit council tenants who were going to be affected by the developments that she was working on. And she told some absolutely heart-rending stories of essentially the poverty that she came across. People who had not talked to people for days on end because they were so isolated. People had absolutely no access to any banking services whatsoever and so couldn't even access their benefits. One person who even hadn't had any running water for several months and just didn't have the wherewithal to even know how to go about trying to fix that. And that is in the middle of one of the richest cities in the world. It's just a mile or two down the road from here. I find that absolutely shocking, actually. And it doesn't happen just in this kind of, on the local basis. It actually happens on a national level as well. I was looking at the kind of food bank statistics again recently, and in the past 5 years, food bank usage has doubled. And the rate of increase of usage is increasing as well. So I think it's probably fair to say that certainly on the social level, our economy is not working for everybody. The same is the case on the environmental front, though. You know all the statistics that you get bombarded with all day as well. But there was one a couple of months ago that really shocked me out of my statistical apathy that I normally kind of reside in, and it was the WWF report. And it made me realize that when I was born, just a tiny little bit over 40 years ago, there were literally twice as many animals in this world as there are now. That's mind-boggling. Where's that going to go? So I think it's fair to say that our economy is ill. And luckily, I think one bright spark is that is now being accepted pretty much across the political divide, which is good. But I use that word ill deliberately. I think actually that the medical sciences have quite a lot to teach us, and there are quite a lot of parallels that we can apply to our economy and how we run our organizations within the economy, which are helpful. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I just want to do a quick thought experiment. Imagine, each one of you please, that your body was an entire economy. Yeah? You've got millions of cells, they're the organizations, they're pumping out the services and products that your economy needs. You've got blood pumping through your veins, it's transporting all the raw materials, the money, the information, the data that we need. And like the real economy, it's fed by nature, it's fed by food and ultimately by the sunlight that comes to our world. And like in the real economy, we also face some big issues. We face things like heart disease, obesity, diabetes, addiction, and we also face one that I know a little bit about, which is cancer. And I want to talk a little bit about cancer, which I realize is going to be, for some people, quite personal and can be a grim topic because we probably all know someone who suffers cancer. But I think it's also going to be quite instructive, so please bear with me. Now, cancer comes in lots of different forms and lots of different symptoms, lots of different root causes, but I think there are some general steps that you can identify which are common to most cancers, and I want to just take you through those because I think it'd be helpful to understand. And I'm going to talk first of all about what does a healthy cell look like, and then how cancer develops, and ultimately how cancer starts affecting not just the area that it's in, but actually the wider body. So in the healthy state, what you might know about is that the famous DNA helix. Every single cell, and this is actually quite incredible, every single cell in your body, and there's lots of them, has an entire blueprint for your body, and a copy of the entire blueprint encoded in its DNA. And there are about 20,000 genes encoded in your DNA, which are all the genes you need to make a human. Secondly, we need to know when these genes get activated. We can't kind of just do with these genes kind of being expressed and being activated willy-nilly here, there, and everywhere. So what happens is that they exchange a whole bunch of information and a whole bunch of signals with the cells around about them and the environment beyond. That is how we know which gene at which point needs to get activated in our cells and what needs to get produced. And thirdly, in a healthy cell, we also have something called the cell cycle, which looks after growth. Growth comes in for particular regulation in our bodies. And the cell cycle was, in fact, what I did my PhD on a particular protein which is involved in the cell cycle. This is my protein. It's called P53. Actually, it's a quarter of my protein. But I mean, you've got to admit, she's pretty beautiful. I spent 3 years of my life on this protein. And P53 is part of the cell cycle, and the cell cycle determines very accurately when a cell is allowed to grow, how much it's allowed to grow, and particularly when it's allowed to divide or not. And P53 specifically polices your cells, and if there is any whiff of getting out of control on the growth front, any whiff of being cancerous, P53 will arrest your growth, or it might even make you commit suicide if you're a cell. So, just to recap, in the healthy state, every cell contains a copy of the entire blueprint. Cells are regulated by exchanging signals with their surroundings, and growth comes in for particular regulation. So what happens then when cancer develops? Well, the root cause of cancer are DNA mutations, mutations in your genes. And DNA mutations are happening in your body all the time. There's loads of them all the time. The vast majority of them make absolutely no difference at all. But every now and again, one will happen in a gene, and it'll happen inside a gene that matters, and it'll happen inside that gene that matters in a way that actually affects its functioning. And what might happen then is that the controls over the growth of that cell are just loosened that little bit, and the cell starts kind of growing more and more. And as it does that, after a while you start realizing that essentially the purpose of this cell has changed. The cell, rather than thinking, what is my place in this body and how do I contribute what I'm supposed to, it's thinking, actually my purpose is essentially to grow and to grow as much as I can. This is what we call a benign tumor. So it's growing as fast. These things can get quite big, but they're still benign in the sense that they are still self-contained. The third step of being cancerous is that you become malignant. And when you become malignant, essentially you start taking over the cells around about you, and you start changing the behaviors of what is around you, and you make those cells cancerous as well, and you kind of get them to join in with what you're doing. There is then a third step of cancer development, and that is when a tumor starts affecting the wider body. And this can happen in several ways, but the first way is called angiogenesis. and that is that tumors start sucking in a disproportionate amount of resources. And in fact, you can tell that. It's one of the few ways that you can tell what a tumor looks like is that it has a lot of blood vessels around it. It's built the infrastructure to bring in all these resources into it. And in fact, what can happen is that in advanced stages of cancer, that's so extreme that you are essentially starving the healthy cells in your body, and that's why a lot of advanced cancer patients will start losing weight. Secondly, something can happen, which I'm sure you've all heard of, which is a cancer tumor can metastasize. And that's essentially, you can think of that being a part of the tumor breaking off, flowing through the bloodstream, coming to another part of the body entirely, anchoring itself there and growing on there, and again, maybe taking over the cells around about it as well. And eventually, of course, if a cancer starts taking over a vital part of your functionality, or vital organ, then the cancer may be irreversible. Now, you might be thinking, what does this all have to do with our economy and our organizations and how that works? Well, I'm going to put up 3 companies up there. These are companies that I've certainly heard about, talked about as growing very fast. I don't know whether they are cancerous. I think I'll leave you to decide how much they correspond to the things we talked about on the last slide. But certainly, we could say that they seem to have been able to loose themselves of some of the constraints that might inhibit their growth, be that through lobbying, be that maybe through their tax arrangements, or whatever it might be. Next, I don't know, can anyone spot the odd one out on this slide? Anyone got any ideas? Rock is the one that went bust. Yeah, I'm thinking of another odd one out, or another way of thinking about it. Yeah, Nationwide. Nationwide is the only organization here that is still a mutual building society. Yeah? The other 3, and a mutual building society is owned by its members. The other 3 fell foul to a wave of carpetbagging in the 1980s, when essentially the members of the building societies were induced, often for relatively small financial incentives, to vote to convert to become a PLC, essentially to become a bank. Now, whatever you think whether banks are good or bad, I don't really mind, but it's clearly to me an example of the values of one sector being transferred into the values of an adjacent sector. Now, I think we also have some angiogenesis going on in our economy. This is a graph of the money that's been created in the UK between 2000 and 2007, which, as far as I know, are the latest statistics. And about £1 trillion were created by banks in that time. And astonishingly, only 16% of it went into what we would call the productive economy, into businesses and households. The rest went into sectors that are already quite big and mushrooming, be that finance, be that property development, and so on. And I think we can even talk about the fact that some of that weight loss that we talked about earlier is happening as well. This is the Gini coefficient for the UK. The Gini coefficient is the standard way to measure inequality in a country. And you can see that's been going up steadily since the 1960s, and we're now at levels which we haven't seen since the late 1920s. And essentially what this means is that all the resources being sucked up into the rich parts of the economy and the lower parts of the economy do not have those resources available anymore. Like in our cells, they are being somewhat starved, and literally so if you think of the food bank example we talked about. And ultimately, of course, this will start affecting some of our vital functions. This is a diagram from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and they have quantified 9 planetary boundaries, as they call them, which are trying to give us some ideas of the bounds that we need to stay within, and they haven't quantified all of them yet, but 3 of them are already in the red. So we need to do something relatively quickly. Now, these are all kind of examples, to my mind, of, you might call them cancerous behaviors in our economy. Now, the question is, to me, what's the root cause? We talked about in our bodies the root cause of DNA mutations. So what's the equivalent in our economy? What's making this happen? And for me, there's a quite clear equivalence here, in the sense that the mutation of our genes in our bodies corresponds to the changes in our values, the underlying values by which we run our society. Oftentimes, we're not even conscious of these values. They are the stories we tell each other, the assumptions we make knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously. But they have changed over centuries. Let me give you an example. It used to be the case that economics used to very vigorously debate the theory of value. how does economic value get created? And this kind of mirrors to some extent the history of economics. So, think East India Company used to be all about trading. Then it was all about owning land. Then it was all about labor and the Industrial Revolution. You can talk about technology, you can talk about innovation, but interestingly, since the middle of the 20th century, that debate has gone away. And value these days is generally acknowledged to be equal to price. Now, I think there are two things that is interesting about this. One is that I'm not sure everyone would necessarily agree that value is really expressed by price. It doesn't always, it feels quite subjective. And it doesn't always, I don't think, conform to our experience. But secondly, and more worryingly in a way, is the fact that the debate has gone away. I don't think we get taught a theory of value in economics very much anymore. What happens is in Economics 101, we get taught that price equals value, and then we move on. And that actually has some fairly fundamental consequences to how our economy and how our businesses are run. There are other examples we could go into, whether that's GDP as being kind of the general measure of success, whether that is growth being the solution to most of our economic ills, whether that is meritocracy, which, by the way, in the 1950s was coined as a dystopia of something that we should not have, and meritocracy now being essentially the only way of having a fair society, most of us would think. So, I think that the DNA mutations that cause cancer are equivalent to the mutations and the changes in our underlying values that are going on in our society and have been going on for a long time. That's the bad news of the talk. There is some good news coming now. The good news is that there are, of course, lots of new cancer therapies being developed as well. There's immunotherapy that's coming. There is personalized, there is targeted therapy, there is even gene therapy on its way. And one of the things that these therapies have in common is that they take a slightly broader view of things. They understand the system of the body that they are interacting with. They understand how cancer works and the system of cancer and how that works. They do things like trying to reinstate some of the feedback loops that have been knocked out. They sometimes even try and fix the actual kind of DNA mutation which caused it in the first place. And the interesting thing here is this word system, and I've used it quite a few times already, and when I've been talking about feedback loops, that is essentially the language of systems as well. And I want to just spend a minute or two just talking about what a system is, because we're going to refer to that going forward. Systems are all around us. Whether it's the laptop here is a system, our cells in our bodies are systems, we ourselves are systems as well. The organizations that we work in are systems, the economy and even nature as a whole is a system. And the easiest way to define a system is that it's essentially a connected set of elements that interact for a purpose. So your cells in your body, or in your nervous system, for example, are interacting with each other to conduct cells up and down your body. The chips in your laptop are interacting with each other to perform calculations. And essentially, the really good news about systems is that this discipline, which kind of started in the 1950s or so, has been evolving. And it's been evolving in lots of different places. Mathematicians have been thinking about it, scientists have been thinking about it, engineers have been thinking about it, biologists have been thinking about it, all kinds of people have been thinking about it. And what's happened more recently is that people have realized that there are some universal characteristics of healthy systems that hold across all kinds of systems. They hold across natural systems and they hold across man-made systems. And this is actually a really big deal, I think. It's a little bit like, for hundreds of years, economists and managers and so on have been trying to read this kind of metaphorical book called How the World Works. The only issue is it's kind of written in code. Yeah? And no one quite understands what that code is, and everyone's been trying to figure it out. And some people kind of think, well, it's mathematical, some people think it's statistical, and everyone managed to make some progress, and they understand parts of it, and they set up some models, and the models kind of work, but they don't really completely work. And no one quite owns up to the fact that they don't really completely work either. And what I think this realization that some of this systems thinking is so universal does for us is it essentially delivers to us on a plate a translation of this book of how the world works. And that is incredibly important. Now, there are kind of quite a few principles that you can identify as to what a healthy system does and what it looks like. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do just want to give you a couple of examples so that you can get an idea of what it looks like. The first one is circularity. And I'm going to take you back to your bodies. One thing that circulates in your bodies is blood. yeah? And blood circulates to every single cell in your body. And by the way, you have 33 trillion cells in your body. That is an absolutely unbelievable number. Every single cell in your body has its own little blood supply coming to it. It is not the case that we just kind of give some blood to like the big cells at the top and then we expect it to trickle down. Every single cell has its own blood supply. And the way that it does is that we can have a motorway system. You know, we have these big kind of arteries and veins that are kind of pumping stuff really fast and so on. And then we have some A roads, which maybe take things down into our legs and our feet. And ultimately, we kind of end up with the footpaths and the sheep tracks. But ultimately, every single cell gets its own little blood supply. It is clearly really important that the resources in a system are circulated to every single part of that system. If that does not happen, it is not a healthy system. And interestingly, we see this kind of, and the way that this works with this branching mechanism is something that happens all over nature. All over nature, where we're trying to distribute things quickly and efficiently, this happens. So whether it's your lungs that are getting oxygen into your blood, whether it's a tree that is trying to get the nutrients from the ground into every single little leaf, whether it is a lightning bolt that is discharging energy, or even a river delta, they all have this branching structure. They all have big, medium, and small conduits, as it were. And interestingly, the ratios of these conduits kind of conform to power laws, to mathematical rules. Now, we can have a think about what does this look like in our economy. I think it's no secret that there are quite a lot of towns, entire regions in our country that are essentially cut off from economic investment. They are not getting that lifeblood that they need. 50% of our economy, 50% of the poorest people in our economy own only 8.7% of the UK's wealth. Feels to me that's not quite kind of in line with some of these power laws either. And we can take it down to the organizational level as well. Statistics from the US show that the average CEO earns 354 times more than the average worker. That's the average worker, not the lowest paid worker, the average worker in their company. That's up from 20 to 1 in the 1960s. Now, obviously, a CEO is going to be paid more. We have motorways and we have capillaries, yeah? That's fine. But 354 to 1, that doesn't seem like it's quite the right proportions and doesn't conform to those natural power laws which would actually be healthy. So, healthy systems have circulation in that sense of the word. Interestingly, healthy systems also circulate things in a second way, and that is that they reuse. They reuse what they have. They reuse their resources. Now, I'm sure many of you will have heard of the term of the circular economy, which has become rightly so very fashionable and much talked about. And it is the idea that rather than having an economy which essentially extracts resources from nature, uses them once and throws them away and gives them back to nature as waste, we need to reuse these resources as many times as possible, maybe even indefinitely, so as to avoid waste altogether. And there are many businesses that are changing their business models to work more like this, and that is fantastic news, I think. But for me, calling this a circular economy is a slight misnomer, because it feels to me that this is only part of the picture. I think that if you really want to have a circular economy, you don't only have to think about how we use our natural resources, we also need to think about how we circulate our money, and though it sounds a bit strange to say, how we circulate our people as well. The money circulates is fairly obvious. You have investment coming into the economy, you use it in the productive economy, and it then sometimes gets extracted out of the productive economy in the way that we talked about with that £1 trillion as well. Equally with people, we have young people coming into the economy all the time, and God knows we're not doing very well at using them if we think about the youth unemployment across Europe. And this is where it feels a little strange to say, but we also have, people are talking now about surplus people. And I've heard that term quite a few times now, mainly in the debate around artificial intelligence and robots. I think if we want to have a truly healthy economy that certainly reuses everything and is circular in this sense of the word, we need to figure out ways of how we're going to extend people's productive lives, how we're going to use money as effectively as possible, as well as how we use our natural resources. Now, so circulation happens in two different ways. That's a principle is universal across all healthy systems. I want to tell you about a second principle of healthy systems as well. I'm going to tell you a story. A long time ago in a faraway country, there were 16 businessmen who came together, and I'm afraid they probably were businessmen at that point in time. And they were in the middle of a financial crisis. and their banks had told them that they were going to cut their credit, and quite a few of them were potentially facing bankruptcy. What they realized, though, is that they didn't necessarily need their banks to extend credit. They could actually extend credit to each other. And interestingly, they could do so at 0% interest. And in that way, they could carry on trading with each other, and they wouldn't go bust. And when this happened, as you might expect, the banks of that country mounted a huge campaign to stamp out this revolutionary and radical behavior. But the surprising thing of this story maybe is that actually that campaign didn't succeed. And 80 years later, this little currency that these 16 people had put together was still running. And by this point, a quarter of all the businesses in this country were using this currency, and it was putting $2 billion through it every year. And it had been shown very rigorously that, in fact, this currency was contributing to the legendary kind of economic stability of this small country. Now, this story is no fairy tale. This story is about a country that is that hotbed of radicalization called Switzerland, which Stefan and I share an affiliation to, but interestingly, I'd never even heard about until recently. And what it's an example of is it's an example of diversification. And it's an example that in natural systems, natural systems balance efficiency with resilience. And efficiency is tied to growth and size, and resilience is tied to diversity. So in a very small way here, we've created a more diverse system by, rather than having just one currency, having two currencies. That is more diverse and therefore is more resilient, and the economy was more resilient to upturns and downturns. This holds across not just financial systems, though. It holds in all parts of the economy. If you think, and this, again, can be quite concerning. If you think about, we have banking sectors where we literally talk about organizations that are too big to fail. If you think about our tech sector, if you think about our energy sector, we don't have a lot of diversity or resilience in those. And the same can be made, similar kind of argument can be made, again, at the organizational level, maybe more from an HR point of view. So, just to summarize, we've talked a little bit about cancer, we've talked about cancerous behaviors in our economy, we've talked about the underlying root cause of that being the changes to our values, the mutations in our genes, the fact that systems is helpful to us, the fact that universally healthy systems display a set of characteristics like circulation, like balancing what they have. And we've talked about that this kind of gives us an idea of where we need to be heading. What it doesn't do, though, is tell us how to go about that. And at this point, I think it's instructive to go back to our cancer analogy. And three things that we learned were that one is that cancer subverts purpose, and so we need to restore that. Secondly, that it affects the kind of intricate system of feedback loops that we have, and we need to grow back healthy feedback loops. And the root cause of cancer is those changes to the DNA, the genes that we talked about. I'm going to talk about each of those three in turn. Firstly, purpose. Let me take you back to purpose basics. From Aristotle to Maslow in the later period of his life, and Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, we have known that at an individual basis, purpose comes from identifying a goal that is outside of you, a goal that is bigger than yourself, and dedicating yourself to that. Viktor Frankl even goes as far as to say, you cannot achieve success or happiness by focusing on success or happiness. The only way that you will achieve success or happiness is as a byproduct of focusing on that bigger goal that is outside of you. I think this translates directly into the organizational context as well. Organizations shouldn't be about looking after their employees exclusively. It should not even be about looking after your shareholders. I don't even think it should be about looking after your stakeholders. And this is where I think these principles of healthy systems come in and become really powerful. If we know what a healthy system looks like, then that provides, I think, the blueprint for what that bigger goal is that organizations need to be working towards and that they need to be dedicating themselves towards. So if I'm very clear about it, for me, the purpose of an organization is to understand and take its place in a system and to do its part to ensure that that system is healthy. And healthy according to those universal principles that we have discussed. And make no mistake, this is not always going to be in line with the business case. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called purpose, right? It's also not in line with some of the phrases that we hear around this. This is not about doing well by doing good. This is about doing good because otherwise we are not going to collectively be well. This is not about self-interest. It's not even about enlightened self-interest. This is just for me about being enlightened. Because unless we are enlightened, there's not going to be many of us around to be self-interested in not too long a time. Just imagine if every time you had to go to your boss with a new project, and rather than asking you for a business case, your boss asked you for a systems case. Not, how is this going to help our company, but how is this going to make the system in which we operate more healthy? Imagine if everyone's purpose was around that, what our economy would then look like. I'm going to go on to feedback loops. As we talked about in cancer, feedback loops are very complicated and they're very intricate and they're finely balanced, and some have been knocked out that we ought to have, some of them have been created that are not very healthy for us. But actually, if we look outside them, we need to become much more aware of how we interact with feedback loops and kind of develop a sense of what is needed and what isn't needed. But if we look out there, actually there's a whole bunch of really exciting feedback loops that are happening, which we could just amplify a little bit, would be great. So for example, Bristol, Brixton, Totnes, Lewis all have local currencies. A local currency is a currency that you can only spend in local shops. You can't use in chain stores. This is essentially an example of a feedback loop, because we know that if we spend our money in local shops, it circulates 3 times longer in the local economy than if it's spent in a chain store, when 80% of it essentially gets sucked right out of that local economy and into the large corporation that runs it. Equally, we can take that to another level and think about the kind of organization. I don't know whether you've ever noticed that when you send emails, people start sending emails back, and then you send emails back to them, and before you know it, you're kind of in this kind of feedback loop of increasing emails, and it's really unhelpful. Well, 2 German car manufacturers, don't know what it is about German car manufacturers, but they've both decided to do something about it. One of them has stopped emails arriving out of hours. Between 6:15 in the evening and 7 o'clock in the morning, this is Germany, no emails arrive. Equally, one of them has automatically deletes any emails that arrive during your holidays. Imagine that, coming back from your holidays and having an empty inbox. It's incredible. Or at least empty apart from the ones that you didn't do before your holidays. But we can take it down another level and even talk about the individual level, not just even the organizational level. At the individual level, have you ever noticed that you kind of go and buy yourself a new piece of kit and you're quite pleased with it, and then after a while you suddenly realize, I've kind of got this new piece of kit over here. This old piece of kit here is looking a bit drab now. I probably need to upgrade that as well. This is known as the Diderot effect. The more we buy, the more we realize we probably want to buy more stuff. And that is obviously ultimately not very helpful to our psychological well-being, and certainly not very helpful to nature through the consumerism that it generates. So what can be done about that? And this is one of my favorite examples. There are 2 cities in the world that have decided to kind of try and break that feedback loop a little bit. And what they've done, this is Sao Paulo and Grenoble in France, they've banned outside billboard advertising. Who knew? I think that's amazing. I mean, why should you be walking down the street and be assailed by huge big posters which are basically designed to make you feel slightly discontented with the world, so that you go out and buy something, and then because of the Diderot effect you go and buy something else, and then you get into this cycle again. Isn't that incredible? So, there are a whole bunch of really helpful feedback loops out there. Let's come to the last bit, which is around our values and how those have mutated. We've talked about how over hundreds of years our underlying values have changed, and somehow they've got to a place where they are now in line with this economy that we have, which is not really working for all of us. Now I think, given that values are the equivalent of genes, I think it's time for some gene therapy. Gene therapy is the kind of latest and experimental border in cancer therapy and other therapies as well, and basically works something like this. We know that there are some genes that have been corrupted or some genes that are behaving in a way that we don't want. So what if we could actually kind of smuggle into these cells some healthy copies of these genes, or use a gene to knock out a gene that is not being very helpful, or maybe just import a gene that was never even in the cell before, but we know will do some good. And the interesting thing about gene therapy is that the difficult thing is not identifying what these genes are and which ones we want to get into the cell. The difficult bit about gene therapy is how to get the DNA in there. DNA usually sits in the cell nucleus. And it kind of makes sense that it can't get in and out of that very easily, and it can't get in and out of our cells very easily, otherwise it'd just be floating all over the body, and that's not very helpful, frankly. So the difficult thing for scientists to work out is how do they get these genes in and out of cells? And what they use is something they call vectors. To you and me, actually, that's quite often a virus, but they try and disarm the virus before they use it. And they inject this virus with the healthy copy of the gene that they want to get in. The virus infects the cell. That's what viruses do, and that means it literally physically gets inside it, and the gene gets released, and it does its thing inside the cell. Now, I hope that you have maybe started to realize that in our world as well, we have no lack of healthy genes. There are experiments going on all over the place. We've talked about some of them today. It's the local currencies in Brixton and Bristol. It's the email systems. It's the ban on advertising. There are thousands of these ideas around. What we don't have enough of are vectors. We need people who are going to take these genes into organizations and change them from the inside. And that for 10 years is what we have been doing at On Purpose. And I hope it's dawning on you and everyone on you here in the room now that this is maybe what I might be expecting of you as well. Now you might think, well, you know, who am I to be making a change to this? What I would say, though, is that I think we all need to realize that unless we cannot individually live healthy and happy lives unless we are living in healthy and happy systems, be that our family, be that our organization, be that our economy, be that our nature. And we all are critical parts of those systems that we live and work in. And it might feel that, you know, it's kind of someone else's job to come up with this new fancy cancer gene therapy stuff. It's not really my thing. But frankly, we don't have the time for that. It might also feel like, kind of at this point, it feels like we need a miracle to happen. You know, we've got so little time left. But I think we all need to start believing in miracles a little bit more. And I want to leave you with a quote by Charles Eisenstein. And Charles Eisenstein said, "We need to make miracles happen. Miracles are not the intervention by an outside divine power in the contravention of physical laws. Miracles are purely something that was not possible in the old story and is possible in the new story." So what I hope we can all join together and do is to go and find those genes, put them together into a new story, and let's go and infect the world with it. Thank you very much. You coming here as well? Okay, sorry.
Tom, thank you for that extraordinary sort of whirlwind tour, Renaissance man overview of the cutting edge of systems thinking, biology, and economics. Listening to it, I was struck once again by the modest scale of your ambition. For a modest man, you're telling us you've stumbled on the book of life. I'm getting waved at by audiovisual. I need to do something different. Is it working?
Unmuted.
No, I unmuted it, yeah. It should be working. Yeah. I wanted to, it came to me also that there was a very exciting point in our, when I was sort of helping you think through your thesis, when Tom said, I've read all the stuff that's out there, and no one knows the answer. Some people have bits of the answer, and there's some points of light, but I want to get closer to what the answer is. That's a very exciting moment when you realize you're with someone who's actually trying to come up with new thinking, which is what I think you're at the beginning of anyway. I also watched Tom tussle with, throughout this, with the question of how does that big abstract stuff translate into the concrete day-to-day, and how is that a reality? And how do you make that very elegant analogy of how to, what can turn around a cancerous situation into a positive, healthy system? How can that be real? And as he said at the end, how can we be vectors for that? How can we individually be that? In the spirit of that idea, we came up with an experiment, which was, given that one of the most effective feedback loops in human life is conversation, that we would engage in a bit of a feedback loop now and perhaps bring together all three of those solutions or medicines to the problems we're facing, and ask you to have a chat with each other on the question of genes and genes equaling values, and where have you seen in your life, in businesses or in other businesses, what you consider to be positive genes, that is values which are transformative in some way, that change the game or that change the way that things are done positively. And how might you be a carrier of those? So if you've identified something, either it's something you've come across in your own day-to-day, or it's something that you've encountered, you've read about, you've been inspired about, how might you become a vector that infects other cells with those genes, on the basis that, like the cell system, each of us contains somehow the DNA for the whole of society? And finally, if this gene or value were to become widespread, how might the world look different? So to make this easy, we have summarized this in a slide. I don't have the clicker, Tom, so thank you. So if you would indulge us with spending 5 or 6 minutes considering these questions, turn to the person next to you. If it's someone you came with, that's fine. But if it's easy for you to talk with someone you don't know, even better for our feedback loops. And consider these questions. In about 5 or 6 minutes, I'll call time. We'll hear from a few of you before we go on to questions for Tom. Let's go. Okay. Order. Order. No, we're not talking about Brexit. No. So thank you very much. Thank you. So we've obviously started something we can't stop, Tom, and that's a good thing. We'd like to hear from some of you if you'd like to share. I'm sorry to cut you short. I hope these conversations will carry on afterwards in the bar, and indeed for the rest of your lives. Would anyone like to share what you are, if you identified something that you feel is clearly a sort of transmittable value, or, I mean, this could be a behavior, couldn't it, or a practice, it could be all sorts of things, but anyone identified a gene, a positive gene? Yes, lady there.
We had a quick chat and
Mike's coming.
a quick chat, and we were talking about a group of people in Morocco who have set up hiking tourism because they went to local rural communities and they saw the struggle that they were having, and they looked to bring tourism to it. We really felt that really what they were trying to do through this and the value that they had, or gene, was empathy, and they were looking at how they could spread empathy by connecting urban communities with rural communities in Morocco. We then thought about how we come across things and when we feel empathy in our daily lives, and we were talking about homeless communities. and how some people feel empathy towards homeless communities and some people feel pity, or sometimes even, a sense of self-worth in the fact that they're not in that situation. And so we're looking at how we could spread empathy in relation to homeless communities through potentially looking at how you share people's stories and promote people's stories to build that sense of empathy as opposed to pity. And therefore, and if everyone truly felt empathy towards those communities, then hopefully we wouldn't be in a situation we are today with the homelessness crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hi. Hello. Is that working? Good. We were talking. Well, me and Will were talking about systems and how changing the system is difficult because it's so pervasive and we can have ideas and ultimately the system's difficult to change. So I actually asked Will what he's going to do tomorrow to start infecting people. He wasn't sure. And I suggested that maybe there was a way of everybody in his company taking one day a month to rather than do a little thing. So there's lots of little things like not buying from Amazon or using a bit less water or giving some more money away to a homeless person. Or doing lots of little things, but in the company, if everyone spends one day a month doing something, then not only will they do some good, but there will be an atmosphere of changing and developing and being viral.
Yeah, I think what was key as well there, what I said is that, let's say we get 4 weeks off a year on holiday. We see our family, we see our friends, we go somewhere warm, we go skiing, whatever. But if actually everyone spent 5 of those days going somewhere like Madagascar and helping, maintain the ecosystem or going to the rainforest, if we did that every year and also our company contributed to that, so there was an incentive to do that, that would literally, first of all, would open your eyes to actually how important the world that we live in is and how quickly we're destroying it. But secondly, that would breed discussion. And then thirdly, everyone would start acting upon that. So I think that's a key change that could be done.
Thank you. If you can afford to fly to Madagascar. You said something very interesting, the first gentleman, which was systems are difficult to change. I think that's a very interesting question. I almost like to turn that over to Tom as a question, which is, I think one of the things that can be overwhelming for us as we engage with this sort of subject is the idea that there is next to nothing that we can do as individuals to change the system. And it's fine, a bunch of well-meaning people getting together in a lecture theatre talking about, what good people should do. But is it actually possible to change the system? If you extend the analogy of gene therapy, is there something that can happen quickly enough, Tom?
I think it definitely is. And I think the thing that we have to remember is that we are the system. Yeah? The system is made up of us. We are the only ones who are going to make these changes happen. There's no way out of that. Thinking of the system as being something outside of us or something different from us or other people, as those people up there who are the system, that's not going to make change happen. And there are plenty of examples of amazing change that happens actually sometimes very slowly, but sometimes quite quickly. Whether that be the abolition of slavery historically, or at the another end of the spectrum, the campaign on plastics that we've had recently and how quickly that has gone. Now you might say, well, it's plastics and it's about my spoons and whatever, and that's not great. But I think it's, it has had an incredibly fast effect, and the number of people are now talking about plastic, the number of businesses that have changed, and that's just an example of what that can do. Now we're not all an Attenborough, but the point is that actually Attenborough can't make that happen by himself either. He actually needs us all to change too, and so we can start that at either end of the telescope, I think.
Thank you. Just out of interest, I don't know if it's within my remit, but could I have a quick show of hands from those who feel, I'm not sure which to start with, pessimistic or optimistic. Let's start with pessimistic. Pessimistic about our capacity to change the system in time. Hands up if you're a little bit pessimistic. Believe we can do it, not sure we have enough time. Hands up if you're optimistic. And it's a bit more optimistic and a few fence sitters, I think.
One more share, one or two more shares. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
We were talking about values in banking. When I started many years ago in HSBC, we were told lots of stories of how staff did things which were not in the short-term interests of the bank in order to sustain both their customers and also the system. And the big story was when the bank honoured the money they were forced to issue by the Japanese in the Second World War. 30 years later, it doesn't look like that. And the way we've put it is the customer first or is the customer last? So to me, I think the gene is something about the internal processes which check when a decision is made as to who benefits and how many people benefit. That's not a question, it's a share, but hopefully it endorses your discussion. I suppose the question is, do we actually think that things have changed that much, and can they be reversed?
Just another share before we get on to questions. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I hate to say this for the pessimists, but and this is treason. I'm not going to be saying what we're talking about, but to the point. Changing things should not always be very fast. If I could just, on my very small scale, within a company in Egypt, a very small company in Egypt, putting a refugee as a cook over there and having employees enjoy a very high quality of food within their work environment has spread out in less than 2 years to more than 7 other small companies, just because those employees refused going to those companies because of the quality of food that they were having. And that's something, if you think about, so ridiculously mundane. So yes, I think with the right sort of viral effects, change could happen very, very fast.
Brings to mind the tipping point and Malcolm Gladwell and all this stuff. There's still some hope there. Yes, thank you. Tom, I'm going to start asking questions. I'm going to direct questions towards Tom now a little bit more. I'll ask him a couple, and then feel free to join in. If you're absolutely bursting to ask a question, put your hand up, and I'll move on to you. I have an interesting question. I don't know if you have an answer to it. It's interesting to me anyway, and I've been curious about it. Your analogy of P53, which I've sometimes mistakenly call him P45, not right. Hopefully P53 is in a job. What's the so that's the protein that regulates growth and it stops the cells from going out of control. Is that government regulation? What are the other analogies of that? Other than government regulation, what might play that part?
Oh, I think in some ways this is the really big question, isn't it? Because the easy thing is to say, well, it's government regulation. Government needs to figure out how big, what sectors, what companies, and so on should be, and they need to they need to have really clever laws that make that all work. But actually, I'm not sure that's going to happen. Maybe ultimately we will get to a place where we can be clever enough for that, but that's not going to happen for a long time. The thing that I'm really interested in is how can we create. If we believe in the kind of purpose that I talked about, and that organizations genuinely think that their purpose is to contribute to the health of the system, and if we remember that our cells do that in the same way in our bodies, our cells basically, they contribute to the overall health of our body. That's what their purpose is. And remember, they regulated each other by essentially exchanging a lot of information with each other. So a cell in your body knows which genes to activate and how much to grow based on all these signals and information that it's exchanging with its environment. And this is not easy, but what I think would be far more exciting than just say that has to be government regulation is if we were to set ourselves the challenge, what would that look like in our economy? What information do organizations have to exchange with each other? Let's take t-shirt manufacturers. How do all t-shirt manufacturers in the world somehow exchange the right amount of information with each other such that we have, about the right number of t-shirts for everyone in this world? And they're kind of good quality and all that kind of stuff, and we don't have Burberry burning a bunch of his stuff at the end of the year. But how do we kind of create the right amount? And that's difficult, yeah, because it means that we're not growth focused. We don't just kind of go hell for leather on creating as many t-shirts as we can. We go, well, I should create as many as I'm supposed to, given that I know there's a whole bunch of other t-shirt kind of producers around me as well. Now, you might think that that's a bit utopian, but I think that should be possible. And it basically goes to the fact that I think we can be much more collaborative and we can be less competitive than most of us think we need to be.
It does remind me, as you say that, you make this comment about t-shirts and so on, that you haven't mentioned either the words capitalism or socialism. And in some ways, you could see this sort of tilting into a kind of nostalgia for socialism or state socialism. And yet it's not. It's something else you're reaching for. And I feel what's interesting about this conversation is that we're acknowledging that no one knows and that we're in a sort of transitional state. Given that, all the more important are those examples, of the positive genes. So, question for you. I hope this doesn't put you on the spot, but you mentioned businesses coming up with a systems case rather than a business case or a growth case. Have you come across any examples of that in your reading that are hopeful? And how might you go about, or how might a business go about coming up with a purpose that's not about pleasing their customers and.
I'm not sure I've come across businesses that explicitly do that. I mean, you could say that in some ways many charities at least profess to be doing that. They are literally trying to change the systems in which they operate. And by the way, there's another side issue, but I think the distinction between businesses and charities and public sector, I think, is overblown. We should just think about organizations. So I think there are organizations that do that, maybe with different business models. In terms of what we would traditionally call a company doing that, I haven't come across one that does that very explicitly yet, apart from some of the examples that many of you might know around Patagonia, for example, that tells you not to buy their jacket or whatever it is. But I think there are lots of other examples as well which are interesting. I mean, this is maybe just more of a company that is conforming to different set of values, not necessarily anything about the system. But I heard a little while ago the CEO of WeTransfer talk. And WeTransfer is a tech business that allows you to transfer big files around rather than emailing them. And they were founded in about 2009, around about the same time as Tinder, which I'm sure you probably all know of, but no one professes to use. Or maybe these days you do, I'm not sure. And interestingly, so both are tech businesses, both founded around the same time. Tinder did the usual thing where it collects as much data as it possibly can from you. Tinder even collects from you what position you are holding your phone in when you swipe left and right, even though they don't actually know what they're going to use that for. But they collect it just in case, whether you're sleeping or not. I don't know whether you swipe when you're sleeping, I don't know. But anyway, and they share that information, by the way, with the other companies in their group, which include Match.com, OkCupid, that kind of. I don't know, any of you use Tinder? Did you realize that? I'm not sure.
No one's going to say.
No one's going to say. But you can think about it for yourself. Interestingly, WeTransfer took a different approach, and they said, we are not going to collect as much data as we can. We're just going to collect the absolute minimum amount of data that we need. It's probably your email address, and that might actually be it. And we're not going to allow any advertising that kind of follows you around the internet when you've been on our website. And we're going to do that. And they struggled to find investment. And no one would invest in them, because they said, surely everyone collects data. Why wouldn't you? It might make you money in the future. And said, well, we don't think that's right. We'd rather kind of do the right thing and collect what we think we need to, and we think ultimately that'll help us. And interesting, they've grown and have a very loyal following. 2015, 6 years later, they then did find investment because they'd got this reputation for essentially being very trustworthy. So I think that is a prime example of, okay, that's maybe not a systems level thinking, but it is definitely an example of, in two quite similar organizations in the same industry even, people behaving according to different values. And what if we could get everyone to behave a little bit more like WeTransfer?
Thank you for the example. Let's open the floor to questions. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm an optimist, but that's my personal delusion. So just to put that there, we've invented systems which allow genes or memes to flow much more rapidly than previously through media and now through social media. And the majority of that, one might say, has been negative rather than positive. So in the transfer processes, what do you think would be the kinds of systems, the kinds of interventions that would drive that gene meme transfer into something more positive rather than more negative, which is, I mean, what have we got at the moment? Look at France and the Yellow Jackets, and that spread solely through social media to a very destructive place in very quick time.
Thank you, Cliff. Wow. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But for me, I think it's got to be something about people's personal experience. And I think you have to start with people's personal experience and how they interact with other people and what they experience with the people around about them, what they experience at work. And we need to start making a difference to that. It strikes me that a lot of that negativity that you say that is flowing around is people venting their anger at the big system out there. And I don't want to deny that, because I think there's a lot of that anger is clearly justified, and I don't know what the solutions are to that as well. But I think where we need to start making a difference is in people's everyday lives and in their individual interactions, so that they kind of start realizing that something better is possible, and they start having more positive experiences. And the interesting thing that I find about values, it's a theory I read based around something called Schwarz's value complex. Actually, interestingly, there's a fairly universal set of values that most humans kind of have or conform to. There's about 12 of them. And some of them are kind of more collaborative and open-minded and so on, and some are a bit more centered on yourself. And interestingly, this has been shown to be fairly universal across all kinds of cultures. But the interesting thing for me is that they've also shown that these values are kind of a little bit like muscles. You can train them. So the more that you experience and the more that you use some of those more, maybe let's call them open-minded, collaborative type of values, the more you will use them in future. It's a reinforcing feedback loop. Equally, the more that you kind of use the other ones that may be self-interested, maybe closed type of values, the more you will be likely to use those in future as well. And that is obviously a feedback loop as well. And it's difficult to break those kind of loops, but it feels to me that if there's a lot of kind of negative things happening, swirling around in that social media space at the very high level, it feels to me that the place that we need to try and start making changes happen is at the more personal level, making those positive things happen, and then people will realize it's getting better, and that'll be the positive self-reinforcing feedback loop that we want to get into.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for your remarks. Just reflecting on that answer there, I worry that if we focus on the sort of ever-expanding concentric circles, that it plays into the pessimist's hands, that we can do it that way, but it'll be too late. And so my sense is that innovation is to the economic system what weight training is to the body. It builds the muscles, it makes us healthy, and it's occasionally grotesque. And so what I'm wondering is what your thoughts are about how a clear sense of purpose can be a sustainable stimulus of innovation.
Mm-hmm. And are you talking particularly about technical innovation, technology?
No. I think the thing that will cure the economic system is sustainable innovation, driven by an appropriate sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. But I'm just not clear in my mind that the type of clarity that we're talking about in terms of sense of purpose can deliver that level of intervention. And so I'd just love to hear you talk a bit about some of the experiences you've seen, or about how purpose can replace profit as a driver of the innovation that keeps our economy healthy.
Well, the good news is that I think more and more people are coming into economy, and by which I mean the young people, are essentially driven by purpose. And they want to work in organizations, they want to start organizations that are delivering something purposeful. Now, I don't think that they necessarily always have a very sophisticated understanding of what that purpose is, but I think they will be very open and very receptive to finding out about that. That's obviously only one part of the equation, though, and we need to, another big part of the equation, this is where we do come to capitalism, is how do we fund that innovation and how do we invest in it? And that's more difficult, but we have several people in the room who specialize in that topic at the moment. We have social investors here. But also, I do think that we need to think about how do we create specifically mechanisms for funding this kind of thing which does not ultimately rely on big paybacks. I think there needs to be proportionate paybacks, there needs to be proportionate incentives, etc., etc. And then I think the third piece that is going to be necessary for all this kind of innovation, and I'm thinking a little bit more about technology now, but that's what a lot of people think about when they talk about innovation, is what are the feedback loops that's going to keep that in the right place and in a way doing something that is positive. And that is going to require some really clear thinking about governance and some really clear thinking about power. And I think technology has massive potential to help us. But at the moment, the way that power is distributed in the big technology firms that we see, that I find quite scary. And I think coming up with better ideas fairly quickly about how we think much more equitably about governance and power sharing is going to be really important.
Surely the key here is going forward is that people that move in positions of power, such as CEOs, they're actually there for the purpose of good. They're realising that actually if this continues for generations down the line for this company to flourish let alone the world, we actually need to be looking after the planet overall. So surely the people coming up, as you said, that actually getting into business for purpose, they're the people that need to be moved into power. And once that's done in various situations such as Amazon and other big players, then surely it will breed like a good view.
I think that's true, but I think equally we can't just make it reliant on individual people and expecting people to do the right thing. When I talk about power, I guess I'm talking about things like ownership structures. Yeah. And for example, be that cooperative or more democratic or more participatory ownership structures. Especially if we're moving to a world where where there may not be enough work to go round, how do we keep people engaged? Even if not everyone has work, maybe everyone at least has some degree of ownership or some degree of power over what is going on. Thank you. Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm saying, is if you were in a position of power and purpose, then you're not going to want to earn 1,000 times more than the average person below you. You're going to have a completely different mindset for how you actually action and project your business.
Exactly.
Any more hands? Anyone at the back? Lots of front people. Maybe it's just biased that way. Sorry, I saw someone over here first, and we'll go over there.
My question is not very clear because I don't have it clear in my mind, but I was just thinking about two aspects. All these things is very difficult to figure out how we're going to do it, and I was thinking that children they are probably the most adaptable to any kind of situation because they have that sense of intuition, they don't have judgment, they collaborate. And then I was thinking on the other side, how normally painful on average is to change things because you have to be the different one and voice stuff before others, and obviously that comes with a lot of other painful stuff, judgment, and you are the troublemaker. And I'm thinking the role of game and playing and doing stuff with fun and how that could be brought into a possible possibly changing things. So I don't know if
well that has to be part of it, and not just fun and games but actually ultimately joy as well, and I think this is not a kind of a call to arms to be hair-shirt about this. I genuinely believe this is going to be a better, more fun, more joyous world to live in. And it has to be, because we're not going to persuade people to join us otherwise. So I think understanding how that is going to be better and more fun and more joyous for all of us, and making that case is certainly a very important part of all of this. And again, that's maybe one of those genes that we can try and infect each other with a little bit more.
Thank you. There was a question over here.
Thank you, Tom. That was a really lovely talk. I've got a million questions, but I'll try to stick to the one. We talked about feedback loops, and one I'm wrestling with in my mind is stabilizing loops. So how do I, for example, as 1/7 billionth of the human population at least, make a perturbation that's positive that will actually do something useful rather than it going back to the same old? How do I make CO2 reductions that someone else won't just take up because, you know, they can? There's something positive's happened, I'm gonna buy a new car.
Well, I think there's two parts for that, maybe for that answer. One is that all of us are only 1/7 billionth of the world population, but we all maybe need to do something, and if you add it all together, that could be quite amazing. But the other thing I think is that, you know, we are all parts of lots of different kinds of systems as well. And whether that be our family, whether that be our social groupings, whether it's the organization that we work in. And actually let's just take the example of the organizations we work in. Let's just be aware of the feedback loops that are maybe missing. Let's be aware of the feedback loops that we could build in, or where there are too many. What if I could persuade my CEO to come with me and experience what it's like to be on the factory floor of this big multinational that I'm a part of? You know, that's just a small thing. It's a feedback loop that provides that CEO with some information, and that could actually have some quite dramatic consequences further down the line, and that might change how that organization works. That might then change how other organizations work. You know, many of you might know the story of Interface. Interface, for those of you who don't know, is a carpet tile manufacturer. It's a pretty grey kind of business, but it's I think it's the 4th biggest carpet manufacturer in the world. I'm looking down here, but there are no carpets here, so I can't point at them. Interface is also one of the leading companies when it comes to sustainability. And actually, this maybe is an example of a company that is trying to have a systems effect. They set themselves back in the 1990s a goal to become zero harm, as they call it, by 2020. It was earlier this year or last year, they actually said, well, you know what, we're going to reach that goal by 2020, and that's not enough. We're going to launch our new strategy, which is called Climate Takeback. We are not only going to do no harm to the environment, we are going to be actually regenerative to the environment. And we're smiling, I'm getting smiles here from the Interface employee in the second row. And that is actually doing your contribution. That is doing part of your contribution to the wider system, I think. But that story started because Interface had an amazing chairman, Ray Anderson. And the story that I have heard, at least, is that it used to go this way, is that Ray didn't used to be like this at all. He was pretty, he was pretty in it, well, not just in it for the money. He was trying to run a good business. He needed to make a lot of profit and so on. And he, at one point, needed to have this there's this group of people who'd started this sustainability group within Interface. It was a bit tedious, but he kind of needed to meet with them because, frankly, these employee groups kind of happen and you have to show some willing, essentially. Anyway, he ended up showing up late and he'd missed them and so on and so forth. But one of them, and they'd all been waiting there for the past hour and eventually they'd had to leave, but one of them had got this book and they decided to leave that book on his desk. So when he came, he didn't find any other group, but he found that book and he took that book home and he read it. And he describes it as essentially a conversion experience. And he realized then that in 20 or 30 years' time, people like him would be probably prosecuted as criminals for the damage they were doing to the environment. That is a feedback loop of essentially just making someone more aware. That is providing information to someone. And that was done by, a normal employee in a big company who normally doesn't get to see the CEO. And look where that's taken that organization. So I think we should never underestimate actually the power that we do have to make change happen. And we don't always know that it's going to happen, and we maybe don't even know that it does happen. But ultimately, actually, we have a lot of agency to get things done.
Tom, on that note, we're at time. I'd like to ask one final question just to wrap up, which is a personal question for you, which is, there's two parts to this. Has this changed anything about how you look at your life. So what's it changed for you personally in terms of all your business, your organization, sorry, and what's next? What's next for this thinking and for the journey that you've been on?
Yeah. Wow, has this changed anything for me? I think I'm still processing some of it, but certainly this idea that there are these universal principles was, for me, a big light bulb moment. And I think the kind of consequences of that I'm still kind of working through a little bit. I'm sure it will have changes. I think what's next for me, and these are maybe some of the implications of this, is that one of the things I realize is that there is a lot of interesting thinking going on here, especially at the kind of economy level. What there is relatively little thinking about is actually how do we run our organizations in a way that then supports that kind of economy. There is much less around that. And I think one of the consequences that I hope will happen for On Purpose is that we are able to invite lots and lots of people, and I hope this in some ways will be maybe a first of many types of talks and interventions and engagements with all kinds of people, to try and collectively come up with a much better idea of how do we run organizations that are in line with truly healthy economies.
Tom, thank you very much.